A recurring theme within Old Norse literature is about a poet, or to use the Viking Age term, a skald, who encounters pictures on a beautiful building, a shield, or a tapestry, and who feels inspired to recite a poem, thus generating what we would call ekphrases. Whenever discussing the phenomenon of ekphrases, scholars tend to focus on human figures from monumental picture stones and woodcarving, which they perceive as narrative compositions. This might seem somewhat paradoxical, as a general rule, pictures of the Viking Age seldom appear as self-sufficient monuments. More often, they survive as ornaments on utility goods. Most artworks were small and portable, and those surviving are mostly jewelry, difficult word, and metalwork. Here, pictures were expressed in geometric or schematic designs, often beautifully conceived and made, occasionally with human figures, but none whatsoever attempt at realism. Pictorial art from the Viking Age often lacks a clear division between scenic depictions, symbols, and ornamental patterns. This is not only true for small objects, but also for pictures on a rather monumental scale. As an example, let me introduce you to a woodcarving from Ulsa Bay in Norway. Here we behold a group of persons who are framed by beasts of different shapes and sizes. And as you can see, there seems to be a fluent transition between the persons in the center of the composition and those beasts in the periphery. Whereas the persons appear to be in the midst of some kind of conflict-like action. One of them handles a knife, it seems. The beasts are monotonously repeated again and again. And this corresponds rather well with our modern expectations on what ornament should look like. However, on closer inspection, we will see that even some of these ribbon-shaped beasts seem to interact with the events in the center of the whole picture. With other words, what we lack here is a clear line between scenic representations and pure ornament. Another example for the problems that arise when we try to differentiate between scenic and symbolic pictures is bestowed upon us by two brooches. The left one dates to the Viking Age. The right one happens to be slightly earlier. In both cases, we see a person that is clinging onto a couple of beasts. The person on the left is clinging onto snakes. The person on the right is clinging onto a couple of four-legged beasts. Well, some scholars have made claims that the people of the Viking Age had different conventions for different pictorial strategies. Accordingly, figures in scenic pictures would have been viewed in profile, whereas symbolic figures, look to your left, would face the viewer. But I do find this notion rather problematic, as our division between scenic depiction, symbolic depictions, and ornament dates back to the age of the Renaissance, and to me it remains doubtful whether we can press the much older art of the Viking Age into that rather modern mold. Well, anyway, what I'd like you to remember from this little excursion of mine is the idea that ancient pictures do not correspond to our modern ways of perceiving and perhaps also of interacting with the visual medium. The title of my current research project, it's actually in Swedish, can be translated as Transformations in Viking Animal Art. It is intended as a tribute to two things. First, our view on animal art has transformed dramatically during the decades. Whereas old school archaeologists used to regard animal art as a rather nonsensical bling, modern scholars tend to ask about iconographic themes. Second, Viking Age animal art in itself is not static, but shifting. Thus, by this I mean the motif will transform literally in front of our eyes. The focal point of my work is a special kind of female dress adornment characterized by a very dramatic design. I usually refer to them as sculptural brooches. Sculptural brooches are a typical phenomenon of the 10th century. They come in different shapes and they come in different quality classes. They seem to be an Eastern Scandinavian phenomenon, We find them mostly in Sweden and on rare occasions also in today's Russia. In Sweden, as a rule, we cannot say much about the people who commissioned those luxury brooches that occasionally were made of gilded silver and lots of silver. In Russia, on the other hand, the most famous brooch features patterns that likely allude to princely dynasties in ancient Rus. Here comes an example from Yelets in southern Russia, and the ornament seems to share some common traits with important finds in Russia and the Ukraine that have been connected to the princely dynasty of the Rurikids. Sculpture brooches were often cluttered with puzzle pictures. A puzzle picture is an ambiguous composition containing two or more motifs that are entangled into each other. Due to the limitations of our visual system, we cannot perceive all motifs at once. Instead, our vision oscillates between alternative readings. Due to their three-dimensional character, sculptural brooches are best likened to a kind of interactive sculpture that changes shape as the viewer changes perspective. During the course of this motion, certain motifs are fading in slowly while others pop up quickly. And the hallmark of a sculptural brooch is the constant change between opposites. Thus, we find people who transform into beasts, and we find beasts that transform back into people. I believe this shows that sculptural brooches have plenty of agency insofar as they demand the beholder to interact with them in a physical sense. And this leads me into some philosophical musings on our relationship with artifacts. To me, material culture carries a genuine story that needs to be recorded. After restoring this, as I call it, material eloquence, archaeologists may be able to weigh the individual testimony of each and every object against theoretical arguments of a more general nature, and in this way gain new insights. And for that purpose, we need the guts to leave the secure path that has been outlined by previous research generations and to risk a somewhat bumpy ride through uncharted territories. My personal journey has been driven by rather pragmatic research objectives rather than by a theoretically grounded master plan. In order to contextualize my materials, I had to compensate for decades of neglect by initiating a modern typological study with focus on product development and on ancient quality concepts. In order to encircle the underlying roots of animal art production, a socio-semiotic study followed. Finally, an iconographic analysis was due that helped me determine the literal meanings of Viking Age puzzle pictures. In a reference to these three different approaches, I have chosen to label my study as multi-perspective. In retrospect, the guiding principle of my work was to let the current research problem determine my choice of method and theory, and to adapt as the research progressed. And therefore, it does not seem entirely wrong to describe my line of research as a variety of grounded theory. Here come some research objectives from my typological study, but we might as well skip this. A second meeting point with grounded theory emerged during the course of my typological study, when I realized that the fine smiths, or let's say goldsmiths, even though it's mostly silver, when I realized that the goldsmith's way of creating puzzle pictures associates to the poet's way of composing. And this sudden leap of thought came as an important eye-opener to me and steered my entire project, I would say. As a long-term result, I have been able to identify several unknown parallels between Viking Age poetry and animal art, that is on a contextual, on a structural, and on a pictorial level. So both a poet and goldsmith were in need of a patron in order to make real art and not just handicraft. Both scolds and or poets and goldsmiths composed their artwork with reference to the same mental concepts. And finally, both types of artwork, and by this I mean animal art and poems, seem to refer to similar mythological themes. So parallels on a contextual, on a structural, and on a pictorial level, just to name a few. Using a sociosemiotic approach that has been up to date with our neighboring sciences like linguistics and rhinology, I was able to show that the decor of sculptural broaches fills all semiotic functions that are required in order to make a baroque shaped or sculptural broaches, rather, to make them work as a textural medium. And therefore, one might even be tempted to liken the motifs within the animal art to hieroglyphs back in ancient Egypt. However, many significant differences remain. We can talk about that perhaps during the discussion. As a result of my multi-perspective approach, I have been able to place sculptural broaches in the context of Viking Age ekphrasis. In the current archaeological discussion, ekphrasis is still defined as a poem that means to describe a picture. But by that, we happen to miss out on 20 years or so of scientific discourse within our neighboring disciplines. According to the more up-to-date definition, ekphrasis means a verbal text that creates a mental picture in the head of the audience. So when a Scald makes, let's say, makes a poetic description of a boat, he or she bestows us with a mental picture that pops us in front of our inner eyes, so to say. If we transfer this definition of ekphrasis to our sculptural broaches and the social context where they were used, this might mean that the verbal text of a skaldic poem would have worked as a kind of audio guide that helped the audience deciphering different puzzle pictures in a given order. Or to take to a more socio-semiotic term, our sculptural broach would have become part of a multimodal text. And this concludes my little introduction into the potential interplay between skaldic poetry and pictorial art. It is, of course, a theme that deserves much more of a discussion, whereas I only managed to scratch the surface, if even that. But I'm linking some articles to you that might provide you a chance to take a deeper look into the subject. What I would like you to learn from my musings are three things. First, I find it hard to believe that Viking Age people would have invested hundreds, we're really talking literally hundreds of hours into the design and of a rich sculptural broach just in order to cover it in meaningless ornament. Second, Viking Age people lived in an oral culture that was in need of particular strategies to store cultural memories. And third, the memory storages of the Viking Age did not necessarily work like the written record, the written medium that we have today, but perhaps rather as multimodal texts where part of the memory was stored in pictures, other parts in memory and verbal memory, and third parts in the materiality of the object. Well, thank you very much for the attention, and I'm looking forward to our discussion.